Hi, Sohini. Thanks very much for joining us in this inaugural episode of the NIF Individuals podcast. We're going to start straight away. Could you tell us a bit about the book and how you came to it?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be your first guest. The book was born in the specific moment in the aftermath of the Dutee Singh gang rape, otherwise known as Nirbhaya in the public domain, but I prefer to return her name to her. So I remember that there were a lot of us going out protesting. I was also a full-time journalist then. And I joined some of these protests as a reporter, and some of them, of course, as a woman myself. And I remember feeling a great sense of energy at that time. I felt like that anger, while I was very angry and I was very moved by the incident, but I remember feeling very energized and cleansed by the moment. And I felt like that this was the answer, not protest in as much as putting our bodies out there on the street, in the public, in front of everybody, so that it becomes so commonplace. By our, I mean women or anybody who is a marginalized body. And I felt like this is the answer, so that nobody can ask what was she doing there, who was she with. So I felt like that we are here, that we are right here, and it should be so commonplace that nobody thinks of asking this question anymore. And I think it set off this thought process in my mind that who are the women who are seen to have the license to be outside? And my answer was, and it still continues to be, that the only women who seem to be having some sort of license to be out there in the public space are sports people. I think that too comes with caveats, but I feel that if you are dressed as in tracks, obviously, if you have the Indian insignia on your suit, on your clothes, that gives you a whole different level of legitimacy. But from my own time in Delhi, and I was in Delhi when Dutee Singh's gang rape happened, I was there in the years preceding it and a little bit afterward as well. I felt like I used to go running just as a very hobby amateur runner. I felt like there was some grudging respect for the woman's running body, and I felt I was quite a common figure in my locality. I would go out 5 to 6 days a week, probably 5 days a week, and so I guess I became a familiar figure, and I would hear people making way for me, morning walkers, evening walkers. I used to live in a DDA colony, and it has those little grounds inside it, and so there would be walkers, and they would make way for me, and they would say PT Usha, because I think that is the only reference you have for a woman runner. So yeah, my response was exactly like yours. It was amusement, but I realized that the figure of Usha was the only reference that people had for a woman sports person. I mean, this is still, of course, 2012, 2013, when the Dutee Singh incident took place, was, of course, after Shyra, and we've had significant successes in women's sport. But I think just the figure of the woman running outside, the only person you thought of at the time was Usha. And so that's how this book was born, this idea was born, that I say somewhere in my book, the gross disapproving gaze.
Yes, the GDG.
I feel like the GDG, yeah. So I felt like the GDG is lower if you are a sports person, and I wanted to examine what that means, the currency that it brings you if you're a sports person, and what are the licenses it gives you.
And, I think there was a really valuable point that you made, which is the legitimacy offered by wearing clearly athletic clothing and the extra legitimacy of having the Indian insignia, and then you're representing the country. And a phrase that one comes across often is associated with you in your writing is of high nationalism. That is such such a driving force behind the women themselves and their ambitions, and that is what provides legitimacy in the larger cultural sphere as well. So that's your own association with sport, which has come in a bit, and I'd love for you to elaborate on this and also bring in a particular focus on PT Usha herself, who even for you was perhaps amongst the first women you saw on television and who inspired, if I'm correct, to some degree, your approach to running?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, PT Usha remains the central figure for sports and women in India. She continues to be, though she famously missed the Olympic medal in 1984. But I think she's still the touchstone, really. There was an advertisement that the Kerala Health Ministry put out last year, which had become very popular. I don't know if you saw it. It was all over social media. It was an advertisement. It was public service messaging for organ donation, and it was about a woman who was losing weight in order to be fit enough to donate her liver to her husband. And so she was going out running and doing various other things. And of course, it's also Kerala, where Usha is from. But the reference there was, and you saw in the advertisement, you see people referring to her as PT Usha and making way for her. So she remains very central. What I write in my book, she comes at the center point of my book, the midpoint. And what I write about her is that, the fact that she came at a point, I think this is why she remains so central to our public consciousness, is that she came at a point when televised sports started in India. It started with the 1982 Asian Games, where there was a live telecast. And after that, the Indian government allowed import of color televisions. And in fact, there was a marked increase of sales of color TVs. You can see this in the newspaper advertisements of the time. Right. Especially during the 1984 Olympics. So I think the act of watching creates interest and currency. So there were seminal figures in sport, perhaps not as successful, definitely not as successful as Usha, but just very central just by the fact that they were women in much earlier decades, but they were not seen. So unless you were aware of them either as an archivist or as a journalist who's interested or as a researcher, that this is why I feel Usha is so central to our imagination. So I mean, I remember watching her. If you remember those 1980s Doordarshan national integration ads, and she'd be, if you remember, there was a very beautiful advertisement which would begin with, I think, Milkha Singh running with a torch, a sort of approximation of the Olympic torch. And if you remember, almost all the athletes, all the sports people rather, because there are lots of, there's of course Sunil Gavaskar, there's Kapil Dev, almost everybody, there's Prakash Padukone, almost everybody is male. Usha is the first person, the first woman you see properly she's running with deer, if you remember, and I would be running around I would be carrying a plastic mace. And I'm an 80s kid, and we would watch Ramayana and Mahabharata. So I would be carrying a plastic mace because it looked similar. It was the closest approximation to the Olympic torch, and I would be running around our drawing room, our living room.
Yeah. That's the really compelling visual that I was thinking of, is precisely this. There's a point where you mention just watching her on television and then as a child running around and trying to recreate that. And precisely the value of being able to see the visual representation rather than, as you mentioned, an archival. Of course, there were many other women, not many, but several other women before that. And in fact, you do touch upon them as well in your book, starting with Mary D'Souza. And it would be great, actually, if you could take us through the women whose work you've uncovered, several of whom you've met in person, your impressions of them, common threads, if any.
Sure, I'd love to. So I begin the book with Mary D'Souza, who is the first Indian woman to represent, the first woman to represent India at the Olympics. There was another Indian woman, Nilima Ghoshal, and there was a swimmer, but I couldn't access them. And specifically in my book, I chose to focus on running. I'll just a little aside, I focus on running rather than, say, swimming, which also has a considerable history in India, because as I said, I wanted the book was born out of this idea of, putting our bodies out there. And I feel swimming is, it takes you out of sight rather than puts you in sight. And and also it requires access to water.
Yes.
I feel the reason I chose athletics is very clear, is that theoretically you need no equipment. You just, I think now the Indian government has, the athletics federations have made it a rule that you need to run with shoes. But for the longest time, really, you didn't even have that. So you had a lot of barefoot runners. So just because I feel it is the most basic, it doesn't even require a team.
Yes.
So I felt that it was the simplest. Swimming is also pretty simple. It's also a natural element, but if you're a woman, you need at least a swimming costume.
Yes.
So that was my reasoning for running, and also just that it places the woman's body
in the
public space. Yeah,
yes. Absolutely. I think that really comes across even with your first answer in this conversation, that what are the ways in which we can legitimize women being out and about on streets, sometimes in the evenings, in the mornings, just to make the sight of a woman on roads a commonality rather than something to be shocked at, So, and there's, again, we'll refer back to GDG also, because I found that thread very interesting as well, when you refer to your own journey of starting off as a runner and becoming comfortable not only with the physical exertion, but also with the right to take up space and the right to use public roads and to put your body there in an athletic pursuit. So that's another really interesting theme. But yes, absolutely. As you were saying, you focus particularly on athletics and on running.
Yeah. So that's why Mary D'Souza and Nilima Ghoshal represented India at the 1952 Olympics in Helsinki. At the 48 Olympics, the newly independent Indian nation state only sent the hockey team, which of course won gold. So that was a good decision. But 52 was a full-fledged Indian contingent, and I sadly couldn't access Nilima Ghoshal. Mary D'Souza is the first person featured in my book. She's an East Indian, as they say, which means she's a Catholic from Goa. And she grew up in, and she still has a home in one of those fishing villages inside Carter Road. And her father was a motorman in the Indian Railways. Very typical of the athletic profile of the 1940s and 50s in India. I did a lot of newspaper archival work to get a sense of that time. And so the landscape of athletics, both male and female, is dominated by East Indians, Parsis, and Anglo-Indians. So you see a lot of D'Souza, Sequeiras, Mendoncas, Pintos, and certainly women's sport, especially in Bombay. Bombay and Calcutta were the two big centers for women's sport. Especially in Bombay is completely East Indians and Anglo-Indians, some Parsis. In Calcutta, there were some Bengalis. So that's Mary D'Souza. And she was also a hockey player. She was a PT teacher in a school in Bandra. And when she got this call to go to Helsinki, and her life changed after that, though she had what she acknowledges as a very, very ordinary outing. She couldn't get past her first heat, but it made her feel that her life was worth more than a PT teacher, and she took up the decision to be a professional sports person, no matter how disappointing the results were. So it did mark the beginning of an arc in her life. It may seem inconsequential when you think that she didn't get past her first heat, but in her life it made a difference because she came back and she decided to be a professional. Well, not professional because athletics, you have to be an amateur, but she decided to be a competitive athlete, and she took up a job with the Tatas, which allowed her, which was a sort of a sports quota job. So she would sell lipstick at the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay by day at the Taj gift shop, and she would leave by 2:33 to go and practice training for sport. She was also a hockey player, and she represented, it was quite common for athletes, women athletes in the 40s, 50s, right up to the 70s really to represent India in more than one sport, simply because there weren't that many. So if you saw a girl who could run well, you'd often say, why don't you play hockey and volleyball and basketball, and vice versa. Mary D'Souza was actually a hockey player, and the hockey team coach felt that she was a very, very quick runner. She was very fast off her feet. So she came to athletics via hockey. So she was a double international. She represented India in the women's hockey team. And it was an unusual life for an Indian in the 50s, not just as an Indian woman, but as an Indian, because she traveled abroad quite frequently. So it gave her a ticket to an unusual life, even if she didn't have a major success as a sports person. My second athlete that I feature in the book is Kamaljeet Sandhu. She's the first Indian woman to win a gold outside India, 1970 Asian Games, Bangkok. Also a crucial juncture because if you read the newspapers of the time, it was a time of general disappointment. So there was an Air India strike, there were textile mill strikes that were taking place. So the advertisements, the newspaper advertisements would be of textile mill owners, full page ads saying that this is the amount of loss that the country is facing as a result of textile mill strikes. And we need, for India to move ahead, we need people to get back to work and we need to produce, etc. I'm just saying this, that this is a time of general gloom and doom. And if you look in the East, so the front pages of newspapers would either have Air India strike or textile mill strike or Naxalite strikes and bombings and assault in Calcutta. So in the middle of this, you have 1970 December, you have Kamaljeet Sandhu winning a gold. It is a moment of happiness and optimism and brightness. Because right after 1971 is a crucial year. It's the birth of Bangladesh. So another year of bad news before it suddenly becomes a great success. And in those days, in the 70s, you do see a woman on the newspaper. You see Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who is the prime minister at the time. But the only other woman you see on the news pages, I don't mean advertisements. You see a lot of women in the advertisements, textile ads or medical product ads. But the only other woman you see is Kamaljeet Sandhu, who is an extraordinarily striking, beautiful woman. So it's quite something to see what she meant to the national consciousness at the time, because it was a great moment of glamour and optimism to have a woman do well outside and win a gold. So she was quite a figure for the next 10 years or so before Usha burst onto the scene. So then we have Usha, of course, who dominated the landscape in the 80s and early 90s. She had a really good run from about 82. She sort of surfaced with the 1982 Asian Games. And then 84, of course, there was an Amul ad for Usha. So she was that big. And then 86 was the Seoul Asian Games, where Usha won everything. She really won. I think she took all the athletic honors. So 86 is a crucial year because Usha won, I think, everything in athletics, women's athletics. And it's also crucial from, if you look at the landscape of sport at the time, because 82, India hosted the Asian Games very successfully. 83, we win at the World Cup. So suddenly you see a lot of cricket dominating news coverage. Again, I did a lot of news archive work. So 83 onward is when you really see, today we have this idea that all sport in India is dominated by cricket, and it's true for today. But I think it really began in with the 83 World Cup win. And before that, and I've been looking up newspaper reporting on sport from the 40s onwards. There's quite a lot of attention on, I would say, equal attention to all sport. So hockey was, of course, we were very good at hockey, but also women's athletics, boxing, high jump, college athletics. So it's in 83. 80s are very important for Indian sport anyway, because we begin with the Asian Games, and 83 we win the World Cup. Early 80s also is the rise of Prakash Padukone, doing extraordinarily well at the best badminton competitions in the world. I think he won All England in the early 80s. So yeah, I mean, and so you have suddenly a figure like Usha, not suddenly, but you have a figure like Usha who is also getting first page news stories, not only dominating the sports pages, but getting first page news stories at a time when India is finally doing well in sport internationally. So she's a very big figure. And that's why she continues to be so important even today. The midpoint of my book is I look at the three athletes who have been questioned for being questioned for their gender. I mean, gender is the right word to use, but the crass or the common usage in news is sex tests. The three athletes who've been subjected to sex tests. So I'm going to look at Santhi Soundarajan, Pinky Pramanik, and Dutee Chand. And thereafter, the rest of the book. So you could say it's broadly divided into three parts: the early track athletes, ending with Usha. Then you have these three athletes who are questioned for their gender or their sex. And then we have Lalita Babar, who becomes the first Indian woman to make it, to qualify for an Olympic final, qualifying her heats after Usha, exactly 32 years after PT Usha. So that's exactly one generation. In medical terms, 30 years is a generation. So exactly one generation later, we have Lalita Babar qualifying for the steeplechase final and placing 10th in a pretty good, though she was last, she was in the competition all through, not to place, but she put up a really good fight. And it's interesting because Lalita Babar comes from a very different background than Usha. She really made a mark as a road runner, as a marathoner. So she's a long distance runner who came to steeplechase later, but she won the Mumbai Marathon 3 years in a row, and she really got noticed by the India camps because of how good she was as a long distance runner. So that's the big change in Indian athletics, I would say, is that you now have long distance running, and the money for that comes. It's not Indian government sponsored competitions like the earlier athletes who were either all employed with the railways or with the forest department or with the police, and largely trained and facilitated by the Indian government. But Lalita Babar comes from a background of earning a lot of money, a lot of high cash money from winning marathons. So that's the push of neoliberalism, which is the current generation of athletes, from high nationalism to neoliberalism and nationalism. So that's Lalita Babar. Then I look at a school in a district in Maharashtra. It's a rural school called the Sanskriti Samvardhan Mantle. They have a project called the Sunrise Project, where they train girls and boys to run long distance, chiefly because of the money. The huge amount of money is on offer in big marathons like the Bombay Marathon and the Airtel Delhi Half Marathon. And many of the girls have gone on to not only place in marathons, but get government jobs in the forestry department or the police or the BMC, the Bombay Municipal, the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Council, I think it's called the BMC, other smaller municipalities across Maharashtra, but government jobs, which is interesting because suddenly in the community, the girls are viewed as economic prospects. If they can go ahead and get government jobs, the parents think that that maybe it's worth investing in girls as well, because a government job is still very coveted in rural areas, or maybe even in
I think in general,
cities.
The security offered is a massive draw.
Also, the prestige. The prestige of, I think Prime Minister Modi referred to it once in one of his speeches, and I thought it was a very insightful reference. He said, when you work in government, people say service mein hai, and when you work in a private company, they say job kar rahe hai. So I thought that was a very insightful, and it conveys exactly what people feel. There's a lot of respect given to government jobs, and so that's changed the way girls are viewed in the community. Because now that they're viewed as economic prospects, the parents want their daughters to get into the Sunrise Project, get into athletics. In order to do that, they're feeding their girls as much as they are feeding their boys. And so that's already a big change, because if you look at NFHS, which is National Family Health Survey data that the central government puts out, the levels of anemia in women, and anemia is typically an indication of malnutrition. So the levels of anemia in women aged 15 to 49, which is the childbearing age largely, is astounding when you compare it to the levels of anemia in men. it's not listed, there's no malnutrition separately, but anemia, if you look at the World Health Organization, it says that anemia is a sign of malnutrition. So that's already a fundamental change. If girls are being fed as much as sons, if daughters are being fed as much as sons, that is a fundamental change.
This is interestingly the positive of neoliberalization in sport then.
There's lots of positives, I feel. I'm, there's lots to criticize, there's lots to critique rather, but there's lots to be impressed by.
I think the democratization also, as you mentioned, of then the women who are exposed to this, the young girls who are encouraged towards it, that is again very significant. But I found in your telling of the story that you're going to be putting forward in your book, one can visualize and one can really see how media coverage has made such an impact on the lives of the women, on their careers, and on the reflections of their achievements. There's another really interesting aspect of the book that perhaps it wouldn't be pertinent to bring up right now because it isn't complete, but it's the fact that you've actually met several of these athletes. You've had your own conversations with them, your own interactions, and you will continue to have more. A lot of your work is based around physically visiting the places and seeing for yourself and, sort of engaging with the space and engaging with the people. That's an aspect that I'm really looking forward to in your book, because I think that will bring an invaluable perspective to the future of where we can go with this. So,
Of course. And much of what I told you, some of it is drawn from archival work, but some of it is drawn from, say, what Mary D'Souza told me or P.T. Usha told me. Not all of it is drawn from, for instance, I told you that she is Mary D'Souza is a motorman's daughter. So that comes from her personal interview with me. And then I looked it up and I saw that indeed the landscape I had seen it, but I hadn't noticed that the landscape of women's sport was dominated by so many Mendoncas and D'Souzas. So yeah, a lot of the stories I'm telling you come from my conversations with them. And it's particularly interesting to speak to the older women athletes because they've had a chance to think back and look back on their careers, especially Mary D'Souza. God bless her, she's still alive, but she's had such a long, she's in her 80s now, mid-80s, and she's had such a long time to think about her own role. And the government of India gave her an award for her sporting, for her role, for a pioneering role in sport. Sadly, she doesn't have as many medals as I wish she did, though she has a couple of Asian Games medals, and those are quite significant to my mind. But she got recognized by the Indian government only in 2012, which is already almost half a century after she stopped playing. So it was marvelous talking to her because she's had so much time to reflect on what her life may mean and what it may amount to.
The other thing that really came alive for me in reading through the outline for your book, etc., is that there's a sharp sense of what the people themselves are like. Like, for example, there's a couple of points where you mentioned sort of an underlying steeliness to P.T. Usha, a no-nonsense attitude, a sense of knowing that this is what I want to achieve and then going after it with a certain determination. And it's so tangible when you read it. So that sense of personhood also really comes through. And I think in general, this is something we've discussed briefly, is that this comes from a sociological sense of analysis. And I think that's why even when you narrate this story, verbally, it comes through not just as sport, but also as sport tied into society. And your actual job and what most people would know you as is as one of India's foremost film critics. So I wonder now if we can loop cinema into this conversation and the visual representation of athletes on screen. we could maybe start with talking about sports biopics, which are all the rage nowadays.
Sure. And thank you for your thoughtful words on my writing. I myself would not think of myself as one of the foremost critics of film because I have very fine contemporaries, but thank you. It is a thing, right? The sport film became a thing. And this may be a slightly banal answer, especially after you anointed me a sociologist. but much of, I feel, if you look at the Hindi film industry, which dominates conversations, at least in Anglophone media, much of the sport film, the love for the sport film comes from the success of Lagan in 2001, actually. I believe the Hindi film industry works on the basis of formula, and that was a formula that worked, Lagan. So before that, in fact, you don't see sport films. You see a couple of films like Jo Jeeta Wahi Sikandar in the 90s, but that really isn't a sport film alone. It is a film about young people, young love, college, etc., etc. But I think it's the success of Lagan that brought home how successfully you can marry nationalism and sport. It is, in fact, the same story because sport is a way of performing nationalism. So you had Lagan, and then you had Chakti, which is interesting because the central figure in Chakti India, the hockey film, is the coach, the so-called disgraced coach, but it's apparently about a women's hockey team. So they are in the background. And then I think after that, there have been like one after the other, there have been sport films, right? And in 2012 was when you had the first women's sport biopic, which is what your question was. I think it was Mary Kom, which was the first such film, where you had Yauvanika Chopra playing the remarkable, legendary boxer, 6-time world champion Mary Kom. And despite the criticism that came its way, I think it is considered to be a successful film. I enjoyed parts of it. The part of it that I remember the most is when Mary Kom comes back from competition, and there is in her village there is a traditional dance being performed in her honor, and she joins them. And I think somebody, and she's wearing the similar sort of costume as her tribe. It's a tribal dance. And then somebody puts the Indian blazer with the India, with insignia on that left blazer pocket. Somebody makes her wear it, and she's dancing with that. So I remember that specifically, the sort of anointing of Indian nationhood onto the body of the woman sports person. So that was, and there's also a segment towards the end of the film where the text on there's a subtitle that goes up on screen just before her last boxing bout that is shown on the screen. She, of course, remains an active athlete, an active sports person. But there is a subtitle that says, you are encouraged to stand up for the Indian national anthem. So that's what you see in Hindi sport biopics, is the marriage of nationalism and a certain kind of feminism. Then right after that was, I think, Dangal, which was also a bit like Shakti India, in that the central figure is the coach and father. But you have the Povat, the real life Povat sisters being celebrated for their achievements in a very perceived to be quite a masculine sport, wrestling. Thereafter, I think there have been so many. There's Saina. There was a film called Saand Ki Aankh about the two shooter dadis from Haryana, starring Tapsi Pannu and Bhumi Pednekar. Tapsi Pannu is doing a bunch of biopics.
Rashmi Rocket also. Yeah.
Yes. Rashmi Rocket is, I think, sort of modeled on a Hema Das and Dutee Chand kind of persona, because she's clearly in brown face and she's wearing some sort of traditional outfit and running. So I imagine that it's an ode to the Hema Dases and Dutee Chands. She's also doing a film on the Indian women's cricket captain.
Shabash Mithu, I believe it's called.
Shabash Mithu. Then there was a film on Saina Nehwal called Saina this year. I'm sure there'll be a film on Sindhu. So there's a whole bunch of these films, and they typically make the point that the Mary Kom film makes, which is that the Indian woman in service of the nation in sport is heroic.
So there are two threads that I think I'd love to get your input on here. The first is related to, I suppose, the evolution that cinema impacts society, or does society impact cinema? And this is that, in 1992, when P.T. Usha had decided to return to the track, age 28, she'd already had a child. She was 20 kilograms heavier than she'd been at the peak of her training. At that time, the press was very cutting in their criticism of her decision. But then you see the film Panga, which came out last year in 2020, Ashwini Iyer Tiwari's film. And in that, Kangana Ranaut's character is 32 years old. And she also decides to have this comeback. And in fact, her son is very encouraging, so is her husband and her family in general. But the other active champion of her return is the media. Do you think that this trajectory has been shaped by cinema, the intervening years of sort of representing women in this positive nationalist sense?
That's a really good question, right? And I mean, I find it hard to say with certainty, but I mean, if you look at the chronology, you had the Mary Kom film in 2012, and the next big controversy in sport was sadly Dutee Chand's scandal, and she was treated very badly by the media, but she was also saved by the media. So the fact that Dutee's story is so different from Santhi Soundarajan's story, who was forgotten until she was rediscovered. But for Santhi Soundarajan's career, the years of forgetting meant that she had to essentially say goodbye to an active athlete's career. Even if she has a career in sport today, and she does have one, it's as a coach. And she hasn't been able to regain her legitimacy, the medal that she won at the Asian Games in Doha in 2006. But Dutee's story is interesting, and it's different because you have the media reporting quite scandalously in the beginning, I think, because the media had no business leaking this news. Sure, it can certainly be said that the athletic federations mishandled the case, but the media had no business leaking this news without checking with Dutee. So they did that. But at the same time, they also rallied to her support because Dutee got support from the Indian government right away. And that is because of the media and because of certain activists and researchers who came to her aid and who asked the Indian government whether it may be possible to lodge a complaint and to resist this. So the media played both roles. It was both, and the media played this role in case of every athlete who has quote unquote failed their sex test. So even in case of Caster Semenya, who is the biggest possible or the most prominent name in this business of very dubious business of quote unquote failing sex tests, it was the media which leaked the name. So there's a sort of prurient interest in saying, oh, look, this person is not a woman, their gender is not, or rather their sex is not what they claim it to be. And it comes from a very, very shameful history in sport itself, which is that until the 1960s, women were tested for their sex. It was tested whether a woman is really a woman, whether they have the sexual organs of a woman, or whether it's a man pretending to be a woman. Now, it may seem like this is only natural, but think of the fact that men are not made to undergo this. And the reasoning for this is that, okay, a woman in a male category is not expected to win, but a man pretending to be a woman may grab medals. But it was done in a very horrible way. And it is a very shameful history. And the media's role in this shameful history is sadly that of peeping Tom and playing this prurient role in leaking this news. So yeah, I mean, maybe coming back to your question, maybe what we see about Mary Kom and maybe what we even see in Chak De India played a role in stirring the conscience of the media to also do the right thing after doing the wrong thing.
So what we've been discussing so far has been representation in media. What are these women's actual bodies presented as on our TV screens? The other aspect of representation is that of cinema, where in fact there's been a lot of criticism, as you yourself have also pointed out. Taapsee Pannu in brownface for Rashmi Rocket. Before that, Priyanka Chopra playing Mary Kom in the eponymous film rather than an actor from Manipur. Or even with Saand Ki Aankh, there was a lot of criticism about why they cast young actors to play roles of women who were, not young anymore. Like a chunk of the film focuses on them in their old age. And the reasoning given in that particular instance was we have to have actors who can do flashbacks, etc. And there's been a lot of criticism around that, also a lot of opinions, some of which say that, no, you can't justify casting choices in this way. And in fact, there's a great film companion essay that I found by Vinit Masram, where he distinguishes between three forms of casting, which is pragmatic casting and artistic choices, and basically how commerce plays in. So I'd love to get now your thoughts on this form of representation and the dilemma of casting the right people.
Yeah, that's a great and difficult question. My sense is that it's not limited to women alone, that the Hindi film industry, the mainstream Hindi film industry, sometimes known as Bollywood, has this problem of representation with everybody. So it's not just a Mary Kom who is played by an actor from Punjab or from the mainland, so to speak. But even in a film like Gully Boy, you have a South Bombay actor like Ranveer Singh in brownface. So I feel there's a very good essay in Caravan by Tanul Thakur, where he talks about how only a certain kind of look is the kind of look that makes it. And this is typically very wealthy people. And so therefore, brownface sadly becomes a necessity because they want to have a certain kind of authenticity. So they'll brown face you to make you look poor. But the thing is that you need to have an enormous amount of wealth in order to sustain the long and sometimes endless period of quote unquote struggle to make it in the Hindi film industry. And that fact itself makes it accessible to very few people. And all of them do look a certain way. Yes. Let's face it. They all look a certain way, to the extent that when we have somebody even a little bit dusky, if you remember in the 90s, the conversation was that the Hindi film industry, Bollywood has moved forward because Bipasha Basu is getting cast as the leading lady. And she's
in romantic
dark.
scenarios, yes.
Yeah, as the leading lady, right? We are talking about mainstream. We are not talking about the
Indie.
so-called indie or previously the alternative film industry where you had, but they were always described as dusky beauties, right? Smita Patil, etc. But in the mainstream, the 90s conversation was about Bipasha Basu. Then, of course, by the time Deepika Padukone comes along, it has, but even in the beginning, maybe it's still, I really haven't kept up with the film press, so to speak, but she was also described as dusky. So that's how limited the idea of who a leading lady can be. So when you talk about it's a very pertinent question, why is an actor from Manipur not being cast to play Mary Kom? Very good question, but are actors from Manipur playing any roles in the Hindi film industry, the mainstream Hindi film industry? I'm not at all defending the industry. I'm just saying that there are many questions that need to be answered before you come there.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is not specifically for women, right? Because even male sports people, they are all played by a few men, right? It's either Amir Khan has done a bunch of roles. He's in fact acted in Dojita Wahi Sikandar as well, which is pre-Lagan. Also half a sport film at least. And then Lagan, and then Dangal. Shah Rukh Khan has done. And then you'll have Ranveer Singh, I think. Now he's going to play Kapil Dev. But they're all mainstream stars, right?
Yeah, and in fact, as you say, they all come from the same socioeconomic categories, more or less, and they all look a certain way, and our standards of what we want to see on screen are deeply Eurocentric. With women, in fact, it's really interesting to see the influx of actually European women who enter sometimes for the song and dance numbers, sometimes in mainstream roles, etc. So ideas of beauty, which seem to really dominate, I think really factor in. And the other thing then is that where is even the aspiration? Does it seem plausible for young women who are watching to think, I'm going to go to Bombay and the city of dreams, etc. When in fact for outsiders, no quotes because they are outsiders, it seems like such a faraway dream to actually make it, to actually get a role in a movie, even if the role may well be geared for them, even if the role is something they can closely identify with, because there's all of these networks at play. I wonder here whether you think that OTT platforms might be more experimental in their casting choices. Is that perhaps an avenue?
Yeah, certainly. They certainly seem to be. I mean, you see a lot of actors, especially from non-Hindi film industries coming into the role. So you have Fahad Fasil, for instance, from the Malayalam film industry, getting his just dues. He's so brilliant. And he is perhaps a good example of a non-Bollywood leading man, because I find him very attractive because he's such a marvelous performer. But he certainly doesn't have the sort of physical form that a Ranveer Singh or a Hrithik Roshan has. Lot of Bollywood big stars making their way into OTT as well. So both things are happening. It is that the pie is becoming larger. But if I remember right, the first big Netflix India series was the one with Saif Ali Khan in Secret Games. So that is as mainstream as it gets, really, at least as far as the leading man goes, because Saif Ali Khan has been in the Bombay film industry for more than 2 decades. His mother is one of the biggest stars of Hindi cinema and Bengali cinema. So, and Saif Ali Khan has acted in his headlined show on Amazon Prime as well. And he's not the only one. More and more we see announcements of so and so doing their big OTT platform. But to answer your question, definitely, I think it has just increased the size of the pie, and you see a lot of people coming in from other language industries. I see Dhanush, who's already a really big star in the Tamil film industry or the South in general. I see Dhanush getting a lot of just dues as well. The actress Sai Pallavi, who acts across South Indian cinemas, I see her doing very well, and she's already got some rave reviews. Nithya Menon. Sai Pallavi definitely looks nothing like what the Bollywood idea of a leading lady is. She looks normal, so to speak. So yeah, definitely.
Which is so important also, I think, for young women to see people who actually look like them on screen. And in fact, whom I'm thinking of is Rinku Rajguru, who was in Sairat and then I believe just finished it got a lot of acclaim. It's a web series called 100, which I haven't seen, but she's supposed to have been excellent in it. And she was so young when she did that role in Sairat, with so much potential. That's the kind of actor I'd love to see eventually helming a mainstream film, the kind of female-fronted films that Bollywood is now so fond of putting out. I'd love to see eventually someone like Rinku Rajguru as playing the main role in that, seeing her get the kind of patronage that is extended to others.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Marathi film industry is another great example. So thank you for pointing that out. I think people just seem to focus on the Malayalam film industry, but the Marathi film industry has a longer history of interesting cinema. And they've consistently produced a couple of breathtaking films every year. And Sairat is one of them. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right.
So that is one aspect, which is physically, how do we represent these women? The other aspect comes from an article that you had written that I really enjoyed, and it was on seeing women in film reading books and how rare that is. And therefore, what a pleasant surprise it is when you actually see a female protagonist actively engaged in reading. And there are several examples that you bring up. There's also a portion where you talk about your mother's response to some of the protagonists and to critically how you feel seeing these women on screen reading, the sense of self-awareness that it offers, the sense of identification that it would give to you in particular or to me in particular. I'd love if you could talk about that a bit and why that's so important to bring about.
Representation, you mean? A sense of seeing yourself on screen?
Yes, a sense of, largely what it would be tied into would be self-awareness, a sense of existing, having these hobbies and interests in the world at large and not just in your immediate space. That saying, you travel the world, in Matilda, where she's in her room, but she's traveled the whole world because she's got a book.
Right. Thank you for reading and referencing that particular piece, which I also hold quite close to my heart. I feel the Hindi film industry in particular is just sort of discovering that women are human beings too. So that's where it came from. And it also comes from my lineage as a Bengali film viewer, because I've seen characters read books in Bengali cinema for a very long time. And it is actually referring to a very specific historic moment. So if you remember your school history books, I didn't study history afterwards, so I'm going back to school. The descriptions of the British Raj are almost entirely in terms of reforms that were brought about in the lives of women. So there's the abolition of sati, then there's the education of girl children, then there is widow remarriage. Those are largely the three things that are talked about. And the ending of child marriage, which is also primarily something that concerns the lives of girls rather than boys, because it would generally be a 10 or 11-year-old girl who is married off to a 18 or 20-year-old. Not always true. I mean, most famously, I was comparing the marriages of M.K. Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. And Gandhi was actually 1 year younger to Kasturba Gandhi. And Tagore was the typical upper caste Bengali marriage of his time. He was 20. And depending upon the sources that you're consulting, his wife, Mrinalini Devi, was either 9 or 11. So all of these reforms actually are concerning women. And that to me points to a very specific notion of modernity. The idea of modernity comes with the idea of, in India, I'm saying, our modernity is brought to us by colonialism. So the idea of modernity is the idea of women being seen as human beings. So there is no, you're saying we don't want sati, johar, whatever the practice in whichever part of India. You're saying the girl child also needs to be educated. You're saying that widows have a right to be married again and not be cast into penury and live in Vrindavan, Kashi, wherever they were cast out. Much of these reforms came also from Bengali reformers, which is why it is such a moment in Bengali cinema, which is why it is referenced like that, because chiefly this is the work of Tagore. So it is Charulata, which is based on his short story, Chokher Bali made by Rituparna Ghosh, and then later remade for Netflix, I believe. But again, a Tagore story. But Tagore returned again and again to the idea of women. Then there's a film called Ghare Baire by Satyajit Ray. Again, it's the same story of a woman on the cusp of stepping outside.
The home and the world.
The home and the world, exactly.
Yeah.
So that is why this reference of women reading, this is a subtext that Bengali reformers, and so much of the reform that we read in our school history, at least, is Bengali reformers. Some of it is also the Phules and Karve in Maharashtra, but they are also talking about education. And once again, it actually means education of the girl child, because boys were being sent to study anyway. So much of that refers to this particular moment of modernity is, I think, viewed through the lives of the changes that it brought to the lives of women. And Hindi cinema, we see this much later. We see women becoming or being seen as human beings who can also think, not just objects of romantic affection and lust and childbearing. We see that happening only in the last decade or so. And that, I think, it reflects regional differences. I think Bengal was, I'm not suggesting at all that it is more progressive than any other part of India. Just that the encounter with colonialism was earlier and more extensive here. And therefore, you have those concerns about women and what changes were brought about to the lives of women. All these changes, incidentally, I've been reading a lot of Bengali novels which reference this period. Pretty much every change that is now credited to Vidyasagar, Ishwar Chandra Bandyopadhyay, Vidyasagar, Bankim, even Tagore, were actually suggested by British colonial administrators and missionaries first. But they didn't get the currency, because you see a white person saying, you must educate your girls, you must not, burn them on the funeral pyre. It doesn't carry weight. It is only when a Raja Ram Mohan Rai rises up and says, no, they're right, that it carries a certain currency in that society. So all these things were actually said before. And Raja Rammohn Rai was actually, he was a clerk with a missionary called William Carey. And William Carey is important because he's the first person who translates the Bible into Bengali. He's a missionary. He comes to preach the Bible. And he realizes that to preach the Bible, you have to talk in the language of the people. So therefore, he translates it. He learns Bengali. And one of the people he meets and works with is Raja Rammohn Roy. So Rammohn Roy is not happening in isolation. It is happening from the encounter with modernity. And Bengali cinema of a certain period is only referencing this big change, the 18th and 19th century change in the lives of women. Today, you see many of the films in Hindi. There was a Netflix film called Bulbul, which got a lot of attention. It was, I think, also sort of marketed as the reimagining of Charulata. But it is the same story of a girl who is married off pre-pubescent. She's a child when she's married off. She suffers domestic abuse. She suffers rape from her husband and her husband's brother. And then she becomes a person. So it is referencing exactly this period. And there is the figure of the brother-in-law, very similar to the character played by Soumitra Chatterjee in Charulata, who is seen as the person who is the figure who is bringing education and thinking into the lives of these women. So I just feel that it is reflecting that moment when you start thinking of women also as human beings. And to my mind, my analysis that it references this particular, it's modernity. You're navigating modernity. In fact, you see that in a lot of other Hindi films also, where you may not see them as actually performing the act of reading, but in many of these Tanu Weds Manu sort of films, Tanu Weds Manu, Bareli Ki Barfi, the girls are projected as, they have studied in Delhi, they have done their master's degree, they are now working or not working. But it is referenced that they have a education.
Yeah, that was actually going to be part of the next question, which is you have got a lot of writing on precisely this new phenomenon of as Hindi films move towards telling more rural stories or semi-urban stories, that there are all of these liberated, independent women characters. But their main independence seems to derive from the fact that they are sexually free and that they drink and that they smoke. But as you point out, not a lot of them have careers, which may well be feasible. Perhaps it's that they aren't allowed to work, or that, that goes beyond the boundaries of, perhaps that's justifiable. But the reason that even an interest like reading would factor in is that even if they don't have formal careers, what are their hobbies? What occupies their time? What do they think of? What are their interior worlds? Because, yes, I think that narrow-minded focus on just showing that these are free and, demanding women and desiring women, but is that the extent of their desire?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question as well. And I feel that my analysis is quite unambiguous in this regard. I'm not saying that I don't enjoy these characters. I actually enjoy these characters, and they're also reflective of a certain kind of modernity for sure. I'm certainly not judging sexual promiscuity or interest in sex or drinking or smoking. And I think that too is indicative of modernity. But you're exactly right. I feel like you've hit exactly the right button, which is that we don't see hobbies or interests. So one of the favorite films that I reference among Hindi cinema is Damini, where I think Damini, which was made in the early 90s, you may be too young for it, but Damini was a big hit at the time. So it is about a housewife actually. So Meenakshi Shishadri, it is also, she's the titular lead character. Meenakshi Shishadri plays Damini. She's this housewife in a wealthy household. And the story is about her witnessing domestic help's rape, and she decides to seek justice for the help. So this is what I mean. You're absolutely right that you don't see any hobbies also, other than romantic interests, right? So all the hobbies or interests you see are actually to do with men. Whether it's drinking, smoking, they would all fail to my mind, they would all fail the Bechdel test.
Yes.
All these movies. You may want to reference, should I explain what the Bechdel test is, or shall we assume
yes,
that?
Yes, we could, in the line, the Bechdel test is, you may do a better job of summarizing this, but broadly, how many of the women characters engage in dialogue with other women about topics that move beyond men and romantic relationships in a heterosexual framework?
Yeah, that's perfect. You did an excellent job. So much of these characters would fail the Bechdel test, I feel, because even the smoking and drinking, these are basically points of fascination for the men. Some of these films are actually written by women writers, which I find interesting because it means that I see this as what the crime writer Gillian Flynn calls the cool
girl. Yes, that's in my next question. Yeah, and the
cool
first world yoga names. Yes,
cool girl. These are cool girl tropes. But I find it, I guess that this is the Bengali and this is the Marxist in me, that, in all these stories, I feel Tanu Weds Manu, which I enjoyed thoroughly for the music, for Kangana Ranaut's performance, Man Marziya, which also I enjoyed thoroughly. The music was great. Tapsi Pannu was very pleasurable to watch on screen. But I feel like, wouldn't these stories have been different, and wouldn't they have a much more compelling realization, the stories themselves, if the woman worked? Why are they not working? So I guess that's the Bengali Marxist in me. I see things in terms of work and employment and class.
And also crucially creative fulfillment, as we were discussing separately, is that's the space for the woman to move outside, to interact with people outside the domestic sphere, to have political opinions and to inhabit public space.
This is what Damini does so well, that, I always hold that up as an example, that you can have a hobby, or you can have something, you can have a political conviction, or you can have a conviction in social justice. Not everybody needs a job, but you can do that. You can believe in something which is not to do with your marriage or your romantic life. That is what I feel is missing. And to come back to a point I made earlier, I feel this is because you're not perceived as a whole human being.
Yes.
So when you see a woman reading, so I enjoyed this Netflix film Sohini very much, because you see them as, I like the moment where she gives her a Amrita Pritam book and says, see if this helps you make sense of some of the anger and confusion that you're feeling. Because you're saying that a woman's experience of navigating the world may help you navigate it.
And that is precisely the value of good representation and of having access to other stories of and by and about women. What I'm reminded of is partly, I think the thrust of our conversation in the last half hour or so has been pointing to a lack of realistic representation of women. And this may stem in part from a lack of women writing, or a lack of diversity in the women who are writing film scripts. In fact, two recent films that I can think of in which I enjoyed portrayals of women reading, one you reference also in your article is Ratna Pathak Shah in Lipstick Under My Burqa, which is written by Lankata Srivastava. And I think she has a lovely take on these characters and on the space of the city and the the milieu that they inhabit. And the other
and
is
intimacy, right?
Exactly.
I think Alankita Srivastava's main theme is intimacy. But
and
yeah,
it really comes through. And the other is not books so much as newspapers. I find Sridevi in English, where she, initially she reads the paper in Hindi or Marathi, I'm forgetting exactly which. And then the last scene, it's such a compelling scene of the movie where she's on her flight back from America to India. And, the air steward asks, what language do you want your paper in? And she says English first. And then she says, do you have a Hindi newspaper? And it's that to me is the triumph of that movie. So both of these were written and directed by women, so Alankita Srivastava and Gauri Shinde respectively. And that therefore is a much more realistic perspective. Whereas I think the problem with these new female-fronted films is that I do think it comes from a neoliberal place of profiteering and capitalizing on the current moment, but without making the characters rounded, without necessarily investing time into their mental health or their physical desires beyond sex and things like that. So I wonder whether you'd want to expand now upon the aspect that you briefly mentioned, which is the schoolgirl phenomenon. Another article you wrote on First World Yoga Names, which is a hilarious read. We link it down below. And how this translates into Hindi film cinema and Hindi film feminisms.
I wish the answer were as simple as if you have a woman directing or if you have a woman writing, it's better. I mean, of course, that's a good thing in itself. And sometimes you do see the results of that. So it can happen. You can have a woman writer displaying the male gaze as well. So it can be. I don't think the answer is straightforward. But having said that, I think it's a great thing if more women direct and more women do the cinematography. So you actually have something approximating the female gaze. Yeah, but sometimes you have I feel some of the most interesting women in Hindi cinema have come in Shoojit Sarkar's films and also in Shujoy Ghosh's Kahani, also Badla, which he remade from the Spanish film. But he has interesting women. And now you can say that I'm the parochial and mentioning Bengalis, but Shoojit often works with a screenwriter called Juhi Chaturvedi, who has consistently written interesting women. I think Piku would be in my list of well-rounded women characters. Also, Vidya Balan's role in Kahani remains very compelling, continues to remain very compelling. I guess I think it's not just gender. I think language and the cognitive windows it opens into other cultures. So therefore, I think maybe when you have, for instance, when you have a Mani Ratnam rom-com, the Hindi version was of Okay Kanmani was Okay Janu, I think. But it did feature, the rom-com featured work aspirations for both the hero and the heroine. So I feel maybe language is another cognitive window. And I know that this is going to be provocative, probably, but I do feel that the Hindi film industry, which draws largely from Punjabi and other North Indian cultures, maybe UP and Bihar now with the Kashyap's and the Bharadwajas, maybe it has different views of women. And sometimes we see this reflecting in the data that the central government puts out when you compare state-wise data on, say, the child sex ratio or maternal mortality, or anemia, and you do see differences in region. Maybe it's the same differences that you see, which result in the girl child getting lesser to eat or not being sent to school, eventually get reflected in the stories that you tell and hear about women.
So there's, I think, a lot of merit to your statement that language is a cognitive window. And maybe we could hear more of your thoughts on that. But I also want to loop back again to the cool girl concept and the first world yoga names, because I think, as you were saying, it would be good to have even women as cinematographers and as directors. And in your article, you refer to this class of Kaira, Shyra, and Tia and Kia. And these are the women who are urban and who have jobs like that, very creative, artistic jobs. So I find that there's an interesting linkage there. And you also talk about how these are all women who will engage in multilingual flirting. And the association that comes up with multilingualism then, and these women and these names, is of flirting in French or in Spanish, and not necessarily flirting in Tamil or Kannada or something like that. So the multilingualism also then is a global sort and not an Indian sort. Maybe we could factor that in as you return to language and the cool girl in India.
Yeah, I mean, that essay was anchored in class. That was the analytical lens that I used. So you're absolutely right in that the multilingual flirting would refer to Spanish or French or those languages, West European and European, classical European languages. So yeah, I mean, because that essay is about class. It's not. The names that you see in these films and the people who inhabit these names, they all belong to the so-called upwardly mobile global class of Indians. So I think I've also enumerated it as Uber users and red eye, yes, Starbucks, red eye flights. So that's the register in which they operate. Definitely not. Most of these films, I think an earlier set of essays about 5 years ago, there were some really good essays by Bharadwaj Rangan and Trisha Gupta about how the Hindi cinema of that time and the Hindi dialogues of that time. So this would be about, the noughties, the early noughties, 2010, 2011. It looked like it was written by people who don't speak Hindi. It looked like it was written in English and then translated into Hindi. And many of the actors who were coming into their own at around this time, people who are now established stars, also seemed like their first language is not Hindi. Their first language is English, but they were translating them in their own minds, or somebody had translated the script. So I think there's a very famous anecdote that Farhan Akhtar has often talked about his father's songs for Dil Chahta Hai, which was his breakout film, and which many people see as the marking point between new Bollywood and 90s and old Bollywood. So I think he, in the title track of Dil Chahta Hai, there is a phrase which is Chamkile Din. And apparently Farhan had told Javed Akhtar, his father, the very, very iconic screenwriter and also lyricist and poet, that this sounds like a detergent ad, a soap ad. And so I think that is exactly, and eventually the word was retained. The song does have this Chamkile Din, but I think that is what it captures. The story captures very much the sort of thing that I was trying to write in this essay about names, that it signifies this particular monolingual, increasingly English speaking in India, and maybe French and Spanish and German speaking in across the globe, as you said. That's the cinema of that moment. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I think you sum it up really well when you say that this is a certain anxiety to fit into a globalized world. And there's a great analogy towards the end where you talk about how a lot of Chinese people will also do this. They'll adopt sort of Western names or anglicized names, but that's their secondary identity, and they retain their traditional names for the home. Whereas in India, not only are we seeing these names in characters, but a lot of Bollywood, the new generation, star kids, so to say, they actually do have these names. There actually is a Shanaya and a Myra and all of these names. So that's another really interesting aspect of the cinema really bleeding into reality.
Yeah, a friend of mine actually pointed out another very interesting indicator of the times and aspirations changing in India. She said that for a long time, generations of Indians would be named after the Nehru-Gandhi family. And this is in fact true. Like my father's generation did have a lot of Sanjays and Rajivs. And my generation has a lot of Rahuls and Priyankas. But if you look at Priyanka Gandhi's children's names, you will see that those names are very much in the Myra, Kaira register.
Yes, of sort of easy accessibility. And you're also right about, a generation of Indians who are growing up with English very much as their first language and who often don't have a grasp on Hindi or whatever their native mother tongue would be.
Yeah, that's the underlying tone. That's the underlying subtext of my essay.
Yes, and
but it's different, right? I mean, I say very briefly at the end that the Chinese don't do this. They are comfortable having two different selves, so to speak. One is a self for the global market, which is for which they have an anglicized Angela or Diana or Steve name, and one is their so-called authentic Chinese self. There's another community that does it closer home. It's people in Bangladesh often or typically will have a Hindu Bengali name. So you will have, there's a fairly well-known Rabindra Sangeet exponent called Rejwana Chaudhary, and her full name is Rejwana Chaudhary Bonna. Bonna means flood in Bengali. And this is a very, very common thing. It's not just famous performing artists who have it. Pretty much everybody has a Hindu Bengali name. Like one of Qazi Nazrul Islam's son has a Islamic name, but he's well known in Calcutta as Qazi Oniruddho. So I think this is a signifier. They are using it to signify a very different thing than what the class of Kaira and Shyra are doing. They are using it to signify a connection to a shared past. So yes, their country, their nation is defined by Islam, is a Republic of Islam, but they are hinting at a shared past with Bengal, which was not classified by religion, but just the language.
I think this is basically, as you say, the underlying motif of what you're exploring here is a very class-based phenomenon of, in fact, class being coded into one's name and an immediate marker of where you come from, and a sort of even a dead giveaway. In the same way that caste is often in India through surname, an immediate marker of where one comes from. So I think this leads one seamlessly into a discussion also of how class and caste intersect in Indian cinema, in Hindi film, in Bollywood, and history, present, and future of that possibly.
Bollywood, if we are using that term for mainstream Hindi cinema, popular Hindi cinema, I think has just sort of rediscovered caste again. I remember the boxing film Mukkabaz by Anurag Kashyap, I think in 2018, having a Dalit coach and talking about what it means to be Dalit. But it was a part of caste, was a part of the Hindi film conversation. So one of my favorite examples is the film Achut Kanya with Devika Rani, directed by Devika Rani and Ashok Kumar, who was a superstar in the 30s and 40s. It's directed by a German who came to make films in India, Franz Osten. So the name itself references caste. It talks about untouchability. Then there's Bimal Roy's Sujata, where there is a plot point about blood donation. That so Nutal's character is seen. She's the protagonist of Sujata. It's sort of what you call an eponymous film, and she is said to be of. I mean, in the story we see otherwise, but she's said to be of a lower caste identity, and her mother-in-law, she's not accepted very well in her marital home, but she's the one who agrees to give blood. Now, blood is, it is a very interesting marker in films right up to, I think, there's an iconic sequence in Amar Akbar Antony as well, where the three brothers, Muslim, Christian, and Hindu are donating blood to the mother who's called Bharti. But anyway, you're using a medical transfusion, which is like Western modern idea, to counter caste, which is representing the old India. So there were films, there was a phase of Hindi cinema which dealt with caste, which seemed to say that, all these things are in the past and now we need to come out of it. And our way to come out of it is Western modernity, the good things about Western modernity, which we will adopt, such as, science and medical science in particular. So it was there, but in general, I feel like definitely Tamil cinema is much better at talking about caste. Bengali cinema is not good at all on caste, with very few exceptions. There is a film called Par about a community which rears pigs, and so I think it has Shabana Azmi and Om Puri, if I'm not mistaken, taking a herd of pigs across from one end of the river from one bank of the river to the opposite bank. There's Satyajit Ray's Sadgati. But in general, Bengali cinema is much better on gender. Tamil cinema is really very, very good on gender as well as caste. And Hindi cinema is, to my mind, quite weak on both.
Yes. I think it's that sanitization and the gap between what Hindi cinema could be versus what Bollywood is, and very much, this Karan Johar brand of filmmaking, etc.
Yeah, that's like a great example. I mean, there's a great anecdote about, when Sairat, which is a caste love story, was when the rights for Sairat to remake it in Hindi were purchased by Dharma. I remember Karan Johar had, or maybe his company had put out a publicity memo which said that because caste doesn't really have a currency in the larger India, we will make it a class story. So in fact, Hindi cinema's register is, to answer your question, Hindi cinema's main register is class. They see everything as a rich, poor class story. So sometimes, especially the older, very classic films like, say, Mother India, is very much a caste story, actually. It's landlord and landless peasants, but it is, these words are absent in the register of the film itself. So if you're well tuned to Indian rural realities or agricultural realities, you will pick it up. But for somebody like me, who I think our last 4 generations have lived in Calcutta, so urban settlement, as a young person watching Mother India without my own registers of how the caste system operates, I saw it as a rich and poor story. The landlord is rich and the peasants are poor. So that is Hindi cinema's favorite mode of operation. That is its register, class, and leaving a lot of things unsaid. But if you are a viewer who is tuned into these things, you can pick them up.
Again, to hark back to your sociological training and frameworks of seeing, I think that's precisely what's needed. Is when we're younger, we can't tell that there's more to understanding why there's a rich and poor divide, what are the structural frameworks at play there. But once one is able to see that this is the structural loop that we're stuck in as a society, then it becomes much easier to critique and to demand. So I think that's an interesting point. What's your final comment then on the commerce of these movies and how profitability will factor into filmmaking in general, in Hindi films and in Bollywood?
I remember when I used to work as a full-time journalist, and I had discussed a story idea with Yauvanika Chopra, who was a columnist at the magazine I used to work in. And she had told me, and it was around the time that Kahani had come out, and there was all this conversation about women helming 100 crore. I think it was one of the first films to cross that barrier, and certainly the first to approach it, at least with a woman star in the lead and no other big male star. And Yauvanika Chopra had told me that, Sohini, the story is done every few years. And I really don't have much to say about it, because every few years there will be a film helmed by a woman which will do really well. But then after that, the Hindi film industry being what it is, and I suppose herself being an insider, also because her mother was one of the earliest film writers, women film writers, it helped her make this point with the clarity that I needed. And she said that the Hindi film industry being what it is, it tends to repeat formulas. And then you will have, again, one film will do well, but others will not do well. And so you'll be returning to, again, 3-4 years later, something will do well, and there will be some feature stories on the women-helmed film project. Now, having said that, this I think is largely true even today. I feel there was a lot of noise made about Kangana Ranaut's rise, and justly so. But then she's done a whole bunch of films helmed by herself which have not done well. Not because the films themselves are bad. I enjoyed Judgmental Hai Kya a lot. But simply because, for whatever reason, the commerce of it didn't hold up. Having said this, I feel that one of the pushes of neoliberalism is gender. It is one of the things that if we identify neoliberalism as a philosophy that argues for the withdrawal of the state and the rationality of the market, that the market can fulfill the role of the state better and more efficiently, if we see that, then we see a general, because you see everybody as an individual, then you see every individual as a consumer. So therefore you see the rise of gender rights in general, whether it's feminism or whether it's LGBT. Because if you're being viewed from the market perspective, then every individual is a consumer and you want to sell something to every individual. So therefore, I see that there is a general interest in telling stories about women and other genders.
Yes, I quite agree with you on this point that the value of neoliberalism, if we were to sort of co-opt it for the purpose of greater inclusion, would be that if you want more and more people as consumers, and I do think as a final point that audiences are becoming increasingly discerning. And in India, sometimes this manifests as, the like-dislike ratio on certain trailers. And I'm not saying that that's always a great metric, but especially with the surplus of content that's now available and an increasing accessibility to that content, I think audience decisions are really going to start factoring in. And therefore, in itself, I think this is a very innate human desire to see what you believe in or to see what you yourself are or what you embody, to see that on screen is such an instinct. Yeah. And I think that will drive automatically cinema in a certain direction. In my opinion, optimistically, a better direction. So that's my final comment.
Same with sport, actually. And so I make the same argument about neoliberalism and sport in my book.
Exactly.
The push that's coming from big money is invariably helping women to greater prominence, actually. Because you want to see these stories of whether it is private foundations or private academies which are producing Saina and Sindhu, remarkable sportswomen, or whether it is the marathoning money. But it is neoliberalism stepping in. It is the money of big corporates saying, here we are selling you shoes, selling you apparel, selling you fitness technology, selling you cities. All the big marathons across the world all the famous ones are sponsored by big banks or big corporates like Standard Chartered or Bank of America or Tata's. And there's a reason for that, because you're positioning the city as an investment destination. And also the act of, if you add to it, even the act of running, of fitness, that is also a neoliberal argument, that it's making the point that your health is up to you. The state doesn't owe you anything. Individuals have the right to be fit and have the responsibility to be fit. In the process, it may be leading to what I'm talking about in my book, that women are being seen as deserving of the same quantity of food as the men. So you are beginning to see them as individuals. So if the market perspective is leading to this, with all the critique that I have of neoliberalism, the Marxist critique, I still think this is something worth paying attention to. Because even as a consumer, if you're viewing a woman as an individual, that's something.
Yes, from a neoliberal perspective, the other interesting aspect of why running would be promoted, or fitness in general, does come from that sense of self-love, and you should prioritize yourself and take care of yourself and look good for yourself, which is, in a sense, a really nice concept. It's just, you don't necessarily have to purchase a lot of things for that. And that's why running is a fantastic thing to focus on, because as you said early on, it doesn't require any additional apparatus.
Yeah, and I guess one of the films that had come to my mind, and my current title for the book is actually The Day I Became a Runner, is an Iranian film called The Day I Became a Woman, which is a 3-part film with 3 short stories about a girl who gets her period. That's the first one. The second one is about this group of women who cycle on the weekends, on Saturdays. And so there was an image in the film that has stayed with me. I'll come back to that image. And the third part of the trilogy is about an old woman who has always dreamt of owning a house with furniture. So the second film, which is about this group of cycling women, it has this beautiful drone shot. You see these women in burqas and abayas from above. So they look like these flapping birds on cycles from above, but they all wear different colored training shoes. So that it's a beautiful image. It's also a very neoliberal image because everybody's wearing these different shoes, but it makes that same point about individuality, maybe brought about by the market. But so that was maybe another subconscious image in my mind when I was conceiving this book, and it's remained a part of the book.
I think that is another thread that one can pick up on, even just in this outline stage. But, so this leads us happily, I think, into a space where the idea again of art then would be to discover wholeness in yourself and to actually develop a comfort with yourself and self-awareness and all of these things that across philosophies and ideologies and religions is the common purpose, is how do you yourself and in other people create conditions for self-actualization. Running may be an excellent step towards that. Very reluctantly, we'll have to bring this conversation to a close for no reason other than time limits. But I think that what I'm looking forward to is an exploration of a lot of this work, not only in your book, which will be directly related to sports, but in your other writing, a lot of which is accessible on your own website. We'll have everything linked. So a final comment from you?
First of all, Yauvanika, it was a pleasure chatting. And I'm also reluctant to end this conversation. I want to end actually with, the meme that was doing the rounds during the last week of the Olympics. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but there was a picture of the badminton double Olympic medalist Sindhu picking up a sort of picture of something on her head. And in contrast was a picture of Kareena Kapoor, probably from the film Heroine, lighting up a cigarette. And the question was, I think, as you can imagine, that who is your heroine? Who is your hero?
Ideal Indian woman.
Yeah, so I find it very interesting how the body of the ideal woman is being created again. And this is a process that had begun during the national movement. The national movement was also coded in terms of what the ideal Indian woman would be. And she would be in contrast to the westernized woman. She would be educated, but she would be very traditional and she would be virtuous. She would be Bharat Mata, she would be the holder of tradition. And so the same conversation we now have with definitely the Indian sportswoman, sports and the Indian woman is a big aspiration of the last decade for sure. But maybe perhaps since Usha's incandescent performance in '84. So I just find that it's interesting the turn, it's still the same thing. Who is the ideal Indian woman? And we are still saying the sort of the Tawayef or the performer or the Nachne Wali or the Nautch girl is bad, like we said around the time of the national movement. But now we have the Bharat Mata figure is now the sportswoman.
The very valid point that you've raised is where we need to move towards is to see women as complex individuals and as containing multitudes.
As just human beings, I think. Let's see, can we see women as human?